For centuries, explorers have marched into the unknown, risking their lives for a single dream, a city made entirely of gold. But was El Dorado ever real, or was it the greatest lie ever told? Imagine jungles swallowing entire armies, rivers carrying away ships, and rulers whose wealth seemed limitless. From conquistadors who vanished without a trace, to mysterious rituals that turned legends into obsession, the story of El Dorado isn't just about treasure. It's about power, greed, and the unshakable human hunger for the impossible. Today, we're diving deep into the forgotten trails, the blood-soaked expeditions, and the chilling truths behind the greatest lost city myth in history. Stay with me, because the ending of this story will change how you see El Dorado forever. Origins of the legend of El Dorado. The legend of El Dorado is one of the most captivating mysteries in human history. For centuries, it has fired the imagination of explorers, adventurers, and even kings. The very name El Dorado, which translates to the Gilded One, has become a symbol of unattainable riches and a golden paradise hidden deep in the heart of South America. But how did this legend begin? And why did so many people risk everything, sometimes even their lives, to find it? The story starts in the early 16th century, during the time of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. After Hernán Cortés conquered the mighty Aztec Empire in present-day Mexico and Francisco Pizarro overthrew the Inca Empire in Peru, Spanish explorers were convinced that the New World was overflowing with unimaginable treasures. Gold, silver, emeralds, these were the riches they craved, and they believed the land itself was brimming with more hidden kingdoms waiting to be discovered. It was during this period of feverish exploration that the first whispers of El Dorado began to spread. Interestingly, El Dorado did not originally refer to a city at all. It referred to a man, a king or chief, who was said to cover his body in gold dust during sacred rituals. This golden man would then wash himself in a lake, offering treasures to the gods. The Spanish, already obsessed with finding more wealth, quickly transformed this story into a tale of an entire kingdom made of gold. The earliest accounts of this golden man came from the Muisca people, an indigenous civilization that lived in the highlands of present-day Colombia. The Muisca had a ritual known as the Ceremony of Guatavita, performed at Lake Guatavita, a crater lake northeast of Bogota. According to chroniclers, when a new chief was chosen, he would be stripped naked, coated in sticky resin, and then covered with fine gold dust until he shone brilliantly in the sun. Surrounded by priests and warriors, he would board a raft filled with treasures, gold ornaments, emeralds, and precious stones. At the center of the lake, he would dive into the water, washing off the gold dust, while his attendants threw offerings into the depths. This sacred ritual was meant to honor the gods, not to display wealth. But to the Spaniards, who were driven by greed and ambition, it sounded like evidence of an entire golden empire. They imagined cities with golden walls, temples filled with treasures, and rulers who sat on thrones of pure gold. The legend of the Golden King, the Gilded Man, slowly transformed into the legend of El Dorado, the Golden City. By the 1530s, news of this ritual spread across Spanish colonies. Conquistadors, who had already tasted the riches of the Aztecs and Incas, were desperate for another great prize. One of the first expeditions in search of El Dorado was led by Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada in 1536. He marched into the Andes with hundreds of men, hoping to uncover the Golden City. Instead, what he found were the Muisca people themselves. He managed to conquer them, but no Golden City appeared. Only modest villages and rituals that were spiritual in nature rather than material. Still, the spark had been lit. Other conquistadors, such as Sebastián de Belalcázar and Nicolás Federman, also tried their luck, clashing with Quesada in what became a three-way standoff for supposed control over the land of gold. But none of them found the treasure they sought. Instead, they returned with stories that only deepened the mystery. The transformation of El Dorado from a golden man to a golden kingdom is one of the most fascinating parts of this story. The Europeans, influenced by myths from their own culture, reshaped the indigenous ritual into something far larger than life. It is important to remember that Europeans at that time were still heavily influenced by tales of mythical lands like Atlantis or the Seven Cities of Gold. To them, El Dorado was not just a possibility. It was a certainty waiting to be discovered. The legend grew with every retelling. Explorers spoke of massive lakes filled with treasures, of entire valleys where gold dust covered the ground like sand, and of palaces where everything shimmered. The more the story spread, the more exaggerated it became. Soon, El Dorado was no longer confined to Colombia. It began shifting across the map of South America. Some placed it in the Amazon rainforest, others in the mountains of Venezuela, and still others in the unexplored interior of Brazil. The city became a phantom, always just out of reach, always moving farther away the closer explorers thought they were. One reason the legend endured so strongly was because the Spanish did find enormous amounts of wealth in the Americas. In Peru alone, the ransom of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa was one of the largest treasures ever collected. Tons of gold and silver were shipped back to Spain, fueling the empire's economy for decades. With such wealth pouring in, it wasn't hard for people to believe that even greater riches were still hidden somewhere. El Dorado became the ultimate prize, the crown jewel that would eclipse all others. But the search for El Dorado was not only about gold. For many conquistadors and later explorers, it was also about glory, power, and immortality. To be the one who discovered the fabled city would mean eternal fame. It would mean rising above even the likes of Cortez and Pizarro. The quest for El Dorado was therefore a mixture of greed, ambition, and genuine curiosity about the unknown world. Lake Guatavita itself became the focus of many expeditions. In 1545, Spanish adventurers attempted to drain the lake by cutting a notch into its rim, lowering the water level. They did recover some gold ornaments from the muddy shorelines, which seemed to confirm the stories. But they never reached the treasures supposedly resting at the bottom. Later attempts in the 16th and 17th centuries used crude engineering to drain the lake further, but each ended in failure. The waters of Guatavita remained stubborn, as if protecting the mystery of the Golden Man forever. By the late 1500s, El Dorado was no longer a single place. It was a dream that shifted wherever explorers dared to imagine. The myth began to spread beyond Spain. Other European nations, such as England, Germany, and the Netherlands, heard the stories and launched their own expeditions. El Dorado had become more than a legend of South America. It was now a global obsession. The first chapter of the El Dorado story, then, is about origins, from the Muisca ritual at Lake Guatavita, to the Spanish reinterpretation of indigenous traditions, to the transformation of a gilded man into a golden city. The tale took root in the imagination of an entire continent. This transformation was not just about misunderstanding. It was about hope, greed, and the human tendency to create myths larger than life. And as we move forward, the story only grows wilder. The more the city eluded discovery, the more determined people became to chase it. El Dorado would become one of the most sought-after prizes in the history of exploration, costing countless lives and shaping the destiny of entire empires. The Spanish expeditions and the first great failures. The legend of El Dorado, once rooted in the ritual of the Muisca people at Lake Guatavita, quickly escaped its birthplace and spread like wildfire through the imaginations of conquistadors. The first encounters with the indigenous stories had already given the Spanish a tantalizing taste of gold and ritual. But what came next was far more dangerous. Full-scale expeditions into unknown lands, driven by greed, ambition, and desperation. By the 1530s and 1540s, Spain had already secured unimaginable wealth from the Americas. The treasures of the Aztecs and Incas were flowing back to Europe, and Spain was becoming the richest empire on earth. Yet for the men on the ground, the soldiers, adventurers, and fortune seekers, the promise of personal glory and riches was far more important than the empire's gain. Many of these men, hardened by battles and fueled by stories of gold-covered kings, now turned their attention to El Dorado. The early expeditions were brutal. Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, who had already conquered the Muisca, believed there was more gold beyond what he had seized. His journey into Colombia had cost him over half of his men, yet his hunger for glory pushed him further. At the same time, rival conquistadors such as Sebastián de Belalcázar and Nicolaus Federman also chased the same prize. The three of them even clashed in Bogotá, each claiming rights to the land and its supposed riches. Yet despite all their efforts, none of them uncovered a golden city. Failure, however, did not kill the dream. Instead, it made the legend grow. If El Dorado was not in Colombia, then perhaps it was deeper in the unexplored interior. Each failure only pushed the story further away, like a mirage that shimmered just beyond reach. One of the most ambitious hunts for El Dorado was led by Gonzalo Pizarro, the brother of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of the Inca Empire. In 1541, Gonzalo organized an enormous expedition from Quito, in modern-day Ecuador. He set out with over 300 Spaniards and thousands of indigenous porters and slaves. Their destination was the eastern Andes and the vast Amazon basin, a region completely unknown to Europeans at the time. The journey was catastrophic. The expedition hacked its way through dense jungles, crossed treacherous rivers, and endured swarms of insects. Food quickly ran out and starvation spread. Horses were eaten, leather was boiled into soup, and countless indigenous porters died under brutal conditions. What was supposed to be a glorious march to a golden kingdom turned into a nightmare. During this expedition, Gonzalo Pizarro's second-in-command, Francisco de Orellana, made a fateful decision. When the group split due to lack of supplies, Orellana continued eastward down the Amazon River. Against all odds, he and his men eventually reached the Atlantic Ocean, completing the first known navigation of the entire Amazon. Yet Orellana had not found El Dorado. What he did find were vast river systems, hostile tribes, and a brutal reminder of how unforgiving the land could be. The dream of gold remained out of reach. The Spanish crown, however, refused to abandon hope. With every rumor, new expeditions were launched. Stories carried by indigenous people, whether misunderstood or deliberately exaggerated, placed El Dorado deeper into the continent each time. The Golden Kingdom was said to lie in Venezuela, then in the Guiana Highlands, then somewhere within the impenetrable Amazon rainforest. The city moved with the imagination of those who sought it. Lake Guatavita remained a recurring focus. In 1560, Hernán Pérez de Quesada, brother of Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada, attempted to drain the sacred waters using buckets and makeshift tools. Later, in 1580, Antonio de Sepúlveda organized another attempt with hundreds of men cutting a trench into the crater wall. This lowered the water level significantly, and treasures were indeed recovered. Gold ornaments, jewelry, and offerings that confirmed the Muisca had indeed thrown riches into the lake. Yet the bulk of the treasure, if it even existed, remained hidden. The lake was too deep, too stubborn, and too sacred for complete looting. These half-successes only fanned the flames. If offerings of gold were real, then surely entire kingdoms of gold must also exist. The desperation for success often led to cruelty. Indigenous communities were forced to serve as guides, tortured for information, and enslaved to carry supplies. Many of the supposed clues about El Dorado came from frightened locals who, under duress, told Spaniards whatever stories they wanted to hear, sometimes pointing them toward distant lands just to send them away. The cycle of false hopes, grueling marches, and tragic losses repeated itself again and again. As the century progressed, the obsession with El Dorado extended beyond the Spanish. Other European powers, eager to challenge Spain's dominance in the New World, began chasing the legend. The Germans, through the Welser banking family of Augsburg, had been granted rights to parts of Venezuela by the Spanish crown. Nicolaus Federman, one of their men, had already clashed with Quesada in Colombia. Though he too failed to find El Dorado, his reports helped spread the tale across Europe. The French, Dutch, and especially the English began to take an interest. By the late 1500s, the Caribbean had become a hotbed of piracy and privateering, with nations targeting Spanish treasure ships. If El Dorado existed, capturing it would not only make fortunes, but also break Spain's monopoly on American wealth. The myth of El Dorado was no longer a Spanish obsession. It had become a European one. The failure of these early expeditions is striking. Despite decades of searching, thousands of men, and countless lives lost, the Golden City remained hidden. Yet rather than disprove the legend, each disaster only made it more mysterious. The more unreachable El Dorado seemed, the more people convinced themselves it must be real. This persistence reveals something fundamental about human nature. El Dorado was not only about gold. It was about the dream of paradise, the belief in a place of unimaginable wealth where suffering would be rewarded and ambition fulfilled. For the men of the 16th century, many of whom lived lives of hardship and violence, El Dorado represented hope as much as it did treasure. By the end of the 1500s, the center of the El Dorado myth had shifted once again. Many began to believe the Golden City lay east of the Andes, in the vast and uncharted lands of present-day Venezuela and Guyana. It was here that one of the most famous figures in the story of El Dorado would enter the scene, an Englishman whose ambition and daring would make him legendary. Sir Walter Raleigh, the celebrated courtier of Queen Elizabeth I, would lead one of the most famous expeditions in search of El Dorado. His arrival in the story marked a turning point, as the myth of El Dorado became not just a Spanish obsession, but a stage for European rivalry and imperial dreams. Sir Walter Raleigh and the English obsession. By the end of the 16th century, El Dorado was no longer just a Spanish dream. The myth had spread across Europe, capturing the imagination of rival empires that sought to undermine Spain's dominance in the Americas. Among these rivals was England, a nation eager to challenge Spanish power and hungry for its own share of the New World's wealth. And it was here that one man would step into the legend with unmatched ambition: Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was not just any adventurer. He was one of Queen Elizabeth I's most trusted courtiers, a poet, soldier, an explorer whose charm and daring made him a figure of legend in his own time. But Raleigh was also a man with enemies. His fortunes at court often rose and fell depending on Elizabeth's favor. By the 1590s, he needed something spectacular to restore his standing and secure his legacy. The promise of discovering El Dorado, the golden empire that had eluded the Spanish for decades, was the perfect opportunity. Raleigh first became intrigued by the stories of El Dorado through Spanish accounts. Rumors placed the city not in Colombia anymore, but in the lands east of the Andes, around the Orinoco River Basin in present-day Venezuela and Guyana. These lands were vast, remote, and largely uncharted by Europeans. To Raleigh, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. If Spain had failed to conquer El Dorado, perhaps England could succeed and claim both riches and glory. In 1595, Raleigh set sail for the coast of South America with a fleet of ships. His expedition landed at the mouth of the Orinoco, and from there he and his men began a grueling journey upriver, hacking through dense forests and battling the oppressive tropical heat. Raleigh's account of this journey, later published in his book The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, is one of the most famous sources of the El Dorado legend. In his writings, Raleigh described a kingdom of immense wealth, ruled by a powerful sovereign and filled with golden treasures. He spoke of a magnificent city called Manoa, supposedly located near Lake Parim, deep in the Guyana highlands. The descriptions were extravagant: golden palaces, glittering temples, and a society overflowing with riches. Raleigh claimed that indigenous guides had told him of this wondrous place, and that he had only been prevented from reaching it by the challenges of the terrain and the size of his expedition. Raleigh's book electrified Europe. At a time when tales of the New World already stirred the imagination, his account added new fuel to the fire. El Dorado was no longer a vague rumor. It was presented as a real empire, described in detail by one of England's most respected figures. The idea that a golden kingdom lay waiting in Guyana made people believe the treasure was almost within reach. Yet, in truth, Raleigh had not seen Manoa himself. His descriptions were based largely on hearsay, indigenous stories, and perhaps even his own embellishments designed to impress the Queen and secure funding for future expeditions. Still, the effect was powerful. Raleigh had shifted the focus of El Dorado once again, moving it from Colombia and Venezuela into the mysterious heart of Guyana. But Raleigh's first expedition did not bring back shiploads of gold. He returned to England with little more than stories. Critics accused him of exaggeration, even fabrication. Still, the legend of El Dorado had become so deeply embedded in European imagination that his account was not easily dismissed. For many, it was simply proof that the Golden Empire remained hidden, waiting for a more determined expedition. Raleigh's involvement with El Dorado did not end in 1595. Years later, after falling out of favor with King James I and spending time in prison, Raleigh saw the Golden City as his last chance for redemption. In 1617, he launched a second expedition to Guyana, hoping to finally uncover the riches he had promised. But this journey was even more disastrous. This time, Raleigh sent his son, Walter Raleigh Jr., to lead part of the expedition up the Orinoco. Tragically, the younger Raleigh was killed in a clash with Spanish forces. The expedition failed to find gold, and the death of his son broke Raleigh's spirit. When he returned to England, his political enemies used the failure against him. In 1618, Sir Walter Raleigh was executed by beheading, his dream of El Dorado unfulfilled. Despite Raleigh's tragic end, his writings had already cemented El Dorado's place in the European imagination. His vision of Manoa, the Golden City by Lake Perim, inspired countless maps, drawings, and stories for centuries to come. Even when explorers failed to find it, many believed that Raleigh had simply been unlucky or that the city had been cleverly hidden. Raleigh's expeditions also marked a turning point in the El Dorado legend. What had begun as the story of a gilded king in Colombia had now become the tale of a vast golden empire somewhere in the Guyana Highlands. This shift was crucial because it moved the search into even more remote and difficult terrain, jungles, mountains, and rivers that were almost impossible to navigate with the technology of the time. The more unreachable the city became, the more alluring it seemed. In the years following Raleigh's expeditions, European explorers continued to chase El Dorado across the map. The Spanish, Dutch, French, and English all launched ventures into Guyana, convinced they might succeed where Raleigh had failed. Each expedition returned with new tales, glimpses of golden ornaments, rumors of wealthy tribes, and whispers of hidden kingdoms. But none ever uncovered the Golden City itself. The obsession with El Dorado became part of a larger pattern of European exploration, the relentless pursuit of wealth and glory, often at the expense of human lives and indigenous cultures. The search for El Dorado cost thousands of men their lives, drained fortunes, and fueled endless rivalries between nations. And yet, despite all the suffering, the city remained elusive, more myth than reality. What makes Raleigh's role so fascinating is not just his failure, but his influence. His vivid descriptions ensured that El Dorado would never fade from memory. For centuries after his death, explorers would still point to Raleigh's book as evidence, using it to justify new searches into South America's most dangerous regions. His dream of Manoa outlived him, haunting maps and imaginations long after his execution. By the 17th century, El Dorado had already become more than a place. It was a symbol. For Europeans, it represented not just a promise of wealth, but the ultimate test of exploration, a challenge that required courage, endurance, and faith in the impossible. The City of Gold was always just beyond the next horizon, hidden by mountains, rivers, and jungles, waiting for the next daring soul to uncover it. And as the story moved into the 18th century, El Dorado would continue to evolve. It would inspire new expeditions, new theories, and even scientific interest as explorers and cartographers tried to pin down its location. But no matter how far they searched, the Golden City remained out of reach, an eternal mystery. The Enlightenment and the shifting map of El Dorado. The death of Sir Walter Raleigh in 1618 might have seemed like the end of El Dorado's story, but in truth, it was only the beginning of a new chapter. His vivid writings about the Golden Empire of Manoa and the mysterious Lake Perim continued to circulate across Europe. For more than a century after his execution, explorers, mapmakers, and dreamers clung to his descriptions as if they were proof of something tangible. Raleigh's failure only seemed to make the legend stronger, for many assumed that he had simply not ventured far enough, or that fate had cruelly robbed him of success just as he was about to uncover the city. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Europe was entering the Age of Enlightenment. Science, cartography, and reason were gaining authority, but the lure of mythical lands had not disappeared. In fact, El Dorado adapted itself to the new era. No longer just the obsession of conquistadors and adventurers, it now appeared on scholarly maps and scientific journals. Cartographers drew Lake Perim, often vast in size, on maps of South America, as if it were a geographic certainty. At its shores, they placed the fabled city of Manoa, the new face of El Dorado. Lake Perim itself is one of the most intriguing pieces of the puzzle. For centuries, it was thought to be a massive body of water in the Guiana Highlands, stretching across what is now Venezuela and Brazil. The indigenous peoples of the region did speak of large seasonal floods and wetlands, but European mapmakers transformed these into the image of a permanent inland sea. On its shores, they imagined a glorious city of gold, waiting to be discovered. This blending of real geography with myth gave El Dorado a powerful new foundation. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was charted on maps that scholars and kings could see. Expeditions during the 18th century increasingly focused on locating Lake Perim and the city of Manoa. The obsession spread beyond treasure hunters to include scientific explorers and naturalists who were mapping rivers, cataloging plants, and studying the land. Yet even they could not fully escape the magnetic pull of El Dorado. After all, if a city of gold existed, it would be the greatest discovery of all. One of the most famous attempts to investigate this mysterious region came in the 18th century with the journeys of Charles-Marie de la Condamine, a French explorer and scientist. While his main mission was to measure the length of a degree of latitude at the equator to help determine the shape of the Earth, La Condamine also heard endless local stories about hidden wealth and golden cities. Though he did not find El Dorado himself, his writings ensured the legend continued to circulate within educated circles in Europe. During this era, El Dorado also began to take on new symbolic meanings. To philosophers and writers of enlightenment, it represented the ultimate dream of human ambition, the unreachable utopia that lay just beyond the grasp of reason. Voltaire, in his famous satire Candide, even included a fictionalized El Dorado as a land of peace, prosperity, and happiness, free from greed and corruption. In Voltaire's version, El Dorado was not just rich in gold, it was rich in virtue, an inversion of the European world's corruption. This literary portrayal shows how El Dorado had grown far beyond its original roots. It was now a cultural symbol as much as a geographic mystery. Yet for explorers on the ground, the search remained very real. The 1700s were filled with expeditions that ventured deep into South America, particularly into the Guiana Highlands, where Lake Perim was thought to exist. Again and again, explorers returned empty-handed or with only minor discoveries, small deposits of gold, hints of indigenous wealth, or glimpses of unique landscapes that fueled imagination but failed to prove the existence of Manoa. One of the persistent issues was the reliability of indigenous reports. As had happened in the 16th century, local tribes often told Europeans stories that blended myth, ritual, and reality. In some cases, they may have genuinely believed in distant wealthy peoples. In others, they may have invented tales to satisfy or mislead their unwelcome visitors. The Europeans, eager to confirm their hopes, often heard what they wanted to hear. By the mid-18th century, skepticism was beginning to creep in. Some explorers and scientists started to question whether Lake Perim even existed, much less the Golden City on its shores. Still, the myth persisted. Maps continued to show the lake well into the 1700s and even into the early 19th century. Each time an expedition failed, the location of El Dorado seemed to shift farther into the unknown. it is important to remember how vast and impenetrable the South American interior was for Europeans at this time. The Amazon rainforest, the Guiana Shield, and the Orinoco Basin were among the least explored regions on Earth. Diseases, hostile terrain, and logistical nightmares meant that many expeditions never returned. For those who did, the harshness of the journey often magnified their stories. When they reported seeing hints of wealth or hearing rumors of golden lands, audiences in Europe were inclined to believe them. El Dorado had by now become more than just a lost city. It was a moving target, a shifting mirage that receded each time someone tried to grasp it. Some placed it north, near Venezuela, others deep in Brazil. Still others imagined it beyond the Amazon. The uncertainty was part of its power. Because it could not be disproven, it could always be imagined. The Enlightenment's obsession with classification and order did not kill the myth. It gave it new life. Scientific journals debated its location, maps printed it confidently, and explorers, funded by governments or wealthy patrons, still chased after it. Each failure was explained away as a wrong turn, a poor guide, or bad luck. Surely, the reasoning went, the city must be just a little farther on. By the end of the 18th century, however, the cracks were showing. Enlightenment thinkers who emphasized reason and evidence began to dismiss El Dorado as a fantasy. Yet even as skepticism grew in the intellectual world, the dream refused to die among adventurers, soldiers, and fortune seekers. The idea of an undiscovered city of gold hidden in the jungle was simply too seductive to let go. The 18th century thus marked a strange moment in the legend's history, a time when El Dorado existed simultaneously as both a serious geographic possibility and a metaphorical symbol. It was charted on maps as if it were real, while at the same time philosophers and writers used it as a literary device to explore human folly, greed, and utopian ideals. As the world entered the 19th century, the myth would undergo yet another transformation. The great age of exploration was about to dawn, with scientific expeditions crisscrossing the globe. And among the explorers who ventured into South America was one of the greatest scientific minds of all time, a man whose journeys would change the way we understand the natural world, even as he too was drawn into the mystery of El Dorado. That man was Alexander von Humboldt, and his explorations would bring a new chapter to the search for the City of Gold. The harsh reality of the quest. As the 16th century wore on, the feverish hunt for El Dorado began to spread beyond Spain. The myth had become so powerful that other European nations, the Portuguese, the English, the Dutch, were drawn into the search. Each expedition added new layers of failure, suffering, and disappointment, yet the obsession never seemed to die. The Spanish had scoured Colombia and Venezuela with no success. By the mid-1500s, rumors shifted the legendary city further south, deep into the Amazon basin and the highlands of modern-day Peru and Brazil. Explorers were convinced that if El Dorado was not in the Colombian mountains, then it must surely be hidden in the uncharted jungles beyond. And so the expeditions continued. But these were not journeys of glory. They were grueling, soul-crushing struggles against nature itself. Imagine hundreds of men, armored and armed, trudging through swamps, where their boots sank knee-deep in mud. Rivers teemed with piranhas and caimans. Jaguars prowled the forests, and deadly snakes slithered through the underbrush. Tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever struck down entire groups, leaving survivors weakened and demoralized. One Spanish chronicler described the jungle as a green hell, endless, merciless, where gold is promised, but death is guaranteed. And he was not exaggerating. Food ran out often, forcing men to eat leather straps, insects, and whatever scraps they could find. Many never made it back. It was during this period that one of the most infamous expeditions was launched, led by a man named Gonzalo Pizarro, the brother of Francisco Pizarro, conqueror of the Inca Empire. In 1541, Gonzalo set out from Quito, Ecuador, with over 300 Spaniards, thousands of indigenous porters, and a vision of finding El Dorado. His expedition pushed deep into the eastern Andes and into the Amazon rainforest. But the journey quickly descended into disaster. Supplies dwindled. The jungle closed in around them, They fought constant battles, with hostile tribes defending their lands. Starvation became so severe that some chroniclers recorded instances of cannibalism. Gonzalo's men endured unimaginable hardships. In the end, most of the party perished, and Gonzalo barely made it back alive. It was on this same disastrous journey that another figure emerged, Francisco de Orellana. A lieutenant of Pizarro, Orellana split off from the main group, following the Amazon River eastward. Against all odds, he became the first European to navigate the length of the mighty river, reaching the Atlantic Ocean in 1542. Though his journey was groundbreaking, it yielded no trace of gold. The jungle had claimed countless lives, but El Dorado remained hidden. Still, the lure was too powerful. Instead of learning from these catastrophes, more expeditions followed. Each time, the story of El Dorado seemed to shift further and further away, like a mirage that disappeared the closer one came to it. The city of gold was now imagined to be not in Colombia, not in the Andes, but deeper in the heart of the Amazon basin, beyond reach of ordinary men. By the late 1500s, another legendary figure entered the tale, Sir Walter Raleigh. The English courtier, explorer, and favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, Raleigh was captivated by tales of El Dorado, which by now had become fused with the idea of a wealthy kingdom called Manoa, said to lie on the shores of a vast inland lake in South America. According to the legend, this lake was so wide that one could not see the other side, and its waters shimmered with golden sands. Raleigh organized an expedition in 1595, venturing up the Orinoco River in present-day Venezuela. He wrote glowing accounts of the journey, claiming he was on the threshold of discovering El Dorado. He described a land rich in gold, with kings dressed in jewels and temples glittering with treasures. But in truth, Raleigh had found nothing. His claims were exaggerated, designed to secure further royal funding and to boost his standing at court. Yet his writings had a powerful effect. For centuries, adventurers and treasure hunters would read Raleigh's words and believe that El Dorado still waited to be found. He had, in essence, kept the dream alive. But by now, the myth had taken on a darker edge. Each failure, each lost expedition, each tragic death only seemed to deepen the mystery. Was El Dorado real, or had it always been an illusion? Was it possible that indigenous tales had been misunderstood or deliberately twisted to lure greedy invaders deeper into the jungle, where they would be swallowed by its unforgiving embrace? The truth was becoming harder to grasp, yet the dream refused to die. The very uncertainty of El Dorado made it even more irresistible. For explorers, kings, and ordinary men alike, the promise of untold riches glittered just beyond the horizon. By the dawn of the 17th century, thousands had perished in the hunt for the city of gold. Entire fortunes had been spent, empires had gambled their strength, and yet all anyone had to show for it were stories, bones, and broken dreams. Still, one thing was clear: El Dorado was no longer just a place. It had become something bigger, a legend that embodied the hunger, the ambition, and the madness of an entire age. And yet, even after so many failures, the search was far from over. Because, as we'll see in the next chapter, El Dorado's myth would continue to evolve, transforming into something even more mysterious and elusive than before. The Golden Mirage, from conquest to legend. The 17th century brought with it a strange duality when it came to the story of El Dorado. On the one hand, European powers were beginning to recognize that the dream of an actual city of gold was slipping further and further out of reach. On the other, the legend itself was becoming even more deeply ingrained in global imagination. Despite failure after failure, El Dorado refused to die. In fact, it evolved. The original tale of a golden king slowly transformed into something far greater, a sprawling empire of unimaginable wealth hidden in the dense South American jungles. To many, the absence of proof was not a reason to doubt. Instead, it became proof of just how well hidden El Dorado must be. For Spain, the obsession remained strong. Expeditions were still launched, though on a smaller scale compared to the grand, disastrous ventures of Aguirre or Raleigh. Soldiers, priests, and adventurers wandered deeper into territories few Europeans had ever set foot in. But as the decades passed, the Spanish crown itself became more pragmatic. Maintaining colonies, defending shipping lanes, and dealing with political rivals in Europe took priority. Yet even as royal support waned, individuals continued to chase the dream on their own. One such individual was Philip von Hütten, a German conquistador who ventured into Venezuela and the Colombian highlands in search of El Dorado. His travels ended in betrayal and death, but his accounts only added more detail to the lore, mentioning rivers of gold dust and tribes guarding golden temples. Others, like missionaries, inadvertently fueled the myth by describing indigenous rituals that involved offerings of gold and gems to river gods. It is important to understand how gold itself played into this fixation. In Europe, gold wasn't just a precious metal. It was seen as a divine substance, uncorruptible and eternal. For monarchs, it was the key to funding wars and asserting dominance. For the church, it was a symbol of heavenly perfection. And for adventurers, it was the ultimate shortcut to fortune and fame. With such powerful meanings attached, it is no wonder that the idea of a land overflowing with gold was irresistible. But the cost of this obsession was staggering. Indigenous peoples suffered endlessly as expeditions ravaged their lands. Villages were raided, cultures disrupted, and countless lives lost, all for a city that never revealed itself. By the mid-1600s, El Dorado had shifted from being just a rumor to becoming a canvas onto which explorers painted their hopes and fantasies. Some believed it was hidden deep within the Amazon basin. Others thought it lay on the high Andean plateaus. There were even whispers that it might be found near Patagonia, at the southern edge of a continent. The legend was no longer a single location. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. Interestingly, this was also the era when naturalists, geographers, and scholars began taking more interest in South America. Maps of the continent became more detailed. But strangely, many of these maps still included a mysterious city or lake labeled as El Dorado. Even scientific curiosity couldn't resist the temptation of myth. One of the most famous geographic shifts in the story was tied to Lake Perim, a massive, possibly mythical lake thought to exist in the Guyana region. Some explorers insisted that the Golden City of Manoa, said to be the true El Dorado, lay upon its shores. For nearly 2 centuries, explorers searched for this lake and its golden city. While the lake itself eventually proved to be a cartographic error or exaggeration, it anchored the myth in popular imagination for generations. Meanwhile, the psychological allure of El Dorado only grew stronger. For common folk in Europe, the story served as an escape from hardship. Tales of limitless wealth waiting to be found in the New World stirred dreams of opportunity and adventure. For rulers and elites, the legend was both a temptation and a political tool, encouraging expansion while justifying the risks of colonization. But let's not forget, behind the fantasy, there was also truth. South America truly was rich in gold, silver, and precious stones. Civilizations like the Inca had crafted breathtaking artifacts, temples, and treasures. The Spanish conquest had already revealed staggering wealth in places like Cuzco and Potosí. So when stories of El Dorado surfaced, they did not sound entirely impossible. If one empire of gold had existed, why couldn't there be another hidden just a little deeper in the jungle? The centuries rolled on, and expedition after expedition returned empty-handed, or didn't return at all. Jungle diseases, hostile terrain, and fierce resistance from indigenous groups wiped out countless adventurers. Yet still, the myth endured. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, El Dorado had transcended the role of a mere exploration target. It had become a symbol. Writers in Europe began using it in poetry and literature to describe unattainable perfection or impossible dreams. To call something an El Dorado was to say it was the ultimate prize, perhaps unreachable, but endlessly desirable. And yet, even as the metaphorical meaning grew, the physical search didn't stop. Explorers continued to hack their way through the forests of Guyana and the Orinoco Basin. Many left behind journals describing tribes that possessed gold ornaments, rivers where flecks of gold sparkled in the current, and rumors passed from village to village of a great kingdom far away. Each fragment added fuel to the fire, ensuring the next wave of explorers would set out with fresh determination. What's fascinating here is how the myth of El Dorado adapted with every failure. When explorers failed to find it in one place, they simply moved the location elsewhere. It was never disproven, only relocated. And in this way, the legend became immortal. But the true turning point was yet to come. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European science, archaeology, and anthropology began to advance rapidly. Expeditions were no longer just about conquest and plunder. They were also about study and discovery. In this environment, the legend of El Dorado would be scrutinized like never before. Was there a kernel of truth hidden beneath centuries of exaggeration? As the Age of Enlightenment dawned, scholars, adventurers, and even governments began asking the question anew: was El Dorado a total fabrication, or could the myth have grown from real traditions and rituals of South America's indigenous peoples? The answer, as we'll see in the next part, would be more complicated and more fascinating than anyone expected. The enduring legacy of El Dorado. The tale of El Dorado, as centuries passed, transformed from a geographical pursuit into a symbol, one that far exceeded the physical landscapes of South America. Explorers no longer chased just rivers and jungles. They were also wrestling with the myths inside their own imaginations. By the late 18th century, most serious expeditions for El Dorado had slowed. The sheer expense, combined with the repeated failures, made monarchs and governments hesitant to sponsor new journeys. But the legend didn't vanish. Instead, it evolved into something more powerful than gold itself, a metaphor. Writers and philosophers began to see El Dorado as a reflection of human longing, the eternal search for perfection, wealth, or paradise. In Voltaire's satirical novel Candide, El Dorado is imagined as a utopian society untouched by greed or corruption. Here, gold and jewels are so common that they hold no value. Voltaire wasn't describing a real city, but he was tapping into the same allure that had driven explorers for centuries: the dream of a better, richer, more extraordinary world. This literary transformation ensured that El Dorado would never die, even when geography suggested it never existed. Instead of rivers or lakes, El Dorado lived in poetry, novels, and later, films, becoming a story that every generation could reinterpret. Gold fever and archaeology. Interestingly, the spirit of the El Dorado hunt wasn't entirely lost. Even in the modern era, small expeditions set out into the jungles of Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil, hoping to stumble upon lost treasures. Some explorers claimed to find ancient artifacts, gold figurines, ornaments, or ceremonial masks that seemed to echo the myths. In truth, these discoveries weren't evidence of a single city of gold, but rather of the rich cultures of the Muisca, the Inca, and other indigenous peoples. Their art, their craftsmanship, and their rituals were dazzling enough to spark myths that could outlive empires. Archaeologists now believe that the El Dorado story grew as Europeans misunderstood these traditions, exaggerating them into a mythic empire of unimaginable riches. The irony is that the Real treasure was there all along, not in the form of endless golden palaces, but in the cultural and artistic legacy of the native peoples. Their societies valued gold not as money, but as a sacred material, tied to their spiritual world. It was Europeans obsessed with wealth and empire who inflated these beliefs into the fantasy of El Dorado, the psychological El Dorado. As the centuries passed, historians began to view El Dorado as more than a geographic puzzle. It became a study in human psychology. Why do we chase after dreams that seem impossible? Why do we risk everything, life, wealth, reputation, on an idea? For the Conquistadors, El Dorado was greed wrapped in mystery. For modern readers, it is a reminder of ambition and obsession. The legend teaches us about the power of stories, how a single myth can drive men across oceans, destroy empires, and still linger in the imagination hundreds of years later. Think of Sir Walter Raleigh. who gave his life chasing this dream. Think of thousands of unnamed indigenous guides, soldiers, and adventurers who vanished in jungles or perished in rivers, pulled forward by a story. All of them were caught in the gravitational pull of El Dorado. It shows us something universal. Humans are not just creatures of reason. We are dreamers. And sometimes those dreams, no matter how impossible, shape history more than reality itself. El Dorado in popular culture. Even today, the legend thrives. From Hollywood movies to children's cartoons, from novels to video games, El Dorado is everywhere. Some portray it as a hidden kingdom of gold, others as a lost civilization filled with wisdom. The city has become a blank canvas, ready for each generation to paint their own fantasies upon. The phrase itself, El Dorado, is now shorthand for any unattainable dream, whether it's a career goal, a personal ambition, or a national obsession. When we speak of chasing our own El Dorado, we acknowledge the mix of hope and folly that lies within all human endeavors. This is why the story still fascinates. It is not just history, it is mythology, a living myth that crosses borders, cultures, and centuries. Was El Dorado ever real? So was El Dorado real? In one sense, no. There was never a single golden city hidden deep in the jungles of South America, waiting for conquistadors to find it. Geography, archaeology, and indigenous traditions make that clear. But in another sense, El Dorado was profoundly real. It existed in the rituals of the Muisca, in the shimmering lakes they offered gold to, in the imaginations of conquistadors, and in the pens of poets. It was real in its impact, shaping colonial expansion, driving exploration, and even influencing literature and culture centuries later. El Dorado teaches us that reality and myth are often intertwined. What began as a misunderstanding of native rituals transformed into one of the most enduring legends in human history. And so, the search for El Dorado ends not in a jungle or beneath a lake, but within us. It is a story that reveals the deepest part of human nature, our endless hunger for wonder, for treasure, for something beyond the horizon. The city of gold may never have existed, but the dream of El Dorado is eternal. It glitters not in rivers or palaces, but in the imagination of every person who dares to believe in something greater. Perhaps that is the real treasure, that we are a species not satisfied with what we see, but always searching for what might be. In that sense, El Dorado was never lost, because it was never meant to be found.